Today we have an emergency video as we have a rash of players getting injured and having hamate bone surgery. So we'll talk about that today, and we'll show you exactly how far you should slide these players. And we're not going to panic. Lots of people are panicking that the drafts are coming super soon and they don't know how to reposition or re-rank these players depending on how much of the news of when they're coming back. So we're going to show you how to really relax and look in the data and really look at the value of these players and see where they should be drafted. It's actually not as devastating as I would have thought based on my first predictions, so stick with me. First things first is what is going on with this rash of injuries? When I hear about hamate bone injuries, I keep wondering, what are these players doing? Are they, karate chopping wood all day? Is that how they're injuring their hands? If you have some theories or hypotheses, you can add them in the comments below. But with Corbin Carroll, Francisco Lindor, and even Jackson Holiday all having hamate bone injuries, that's just the way we're starting off the spring, and it's having a huge impact on fantasy baseball, and it's a terrible time for this to occur right before the season, which adds a lot of uncertainty to your drafts, which are happening right around the corner. If you watched my last video, I showed you my player value ranking system where I actually take the accumulated stats that are greater than an average player and I add them together to kind of figure out who are the players I should be drafting, because they allow me to bank the most stats relative to an average player that I can get drafted. And on the left, you can see here you want to draft by the actual player value, and this is what it looks like where, once you get around pick 60, and this is just hitters only for this example, so that's going to be at least around 6, 7, probably even 10 if you're actually drafting pitchers in your league. Then you need to start worrying about drafting, below average players or what's going to happen there. But if you look at some of the current average draft positions that people are doing versus the rankings, you can see here that some below average players are being taken as early as 28 or so, the top 30, and you can see this broad distribution of actual results where people are not taking truly the best value. They're taking people who have the best pedigree or the best name, but their actual predicted stats, because I just took an aggregate of projection systems that I trust. Last video when I shared some of this data, I showed you really how it impacted 2025, but now we're starting to look at some aggregated systems of projections. So take a projection system you trust and do the same type of math for. And you can see you have a very broad distribution between if you're following the high end of this curve for your entire draft, or you end up drafting on the low end of this curve, you can get a huge difference in player value. And that's why in some later videos, I'll show you even if you give someone the number one pick in every single round, you can draft a team to beat them based on how big the spread is in the data versus the actual value that people are projected to have. So obviously get a projection system that you can trust. So now let's take a look at the task on hand for the day. So when you look at the ranking systems and you rate it by the player value, you can see here that Corbin Carroll was actually rated 5th overall based on the projections going into this year, and Lindor was 8th. Corbin Carroll is getting drafted 7th overall currently, and Lindor was getting drafted 16th. That's why in my last video I was talking about how I think he has a lot of upside potential. That's why it's totally devastating that this happened, just as we're telling people to draft Francisco Lindor as a sleeper or someone who can really give you a return on investment, and these guys go and get injured. However, the question now becomes, based on their value, you can see here for Corbin Carroll why he's ranked so high, getting drafted at 7th, really with a rank of 5th based on these projections. And it's because he is above average in everything. He really doesn't hurt you in anything. He's very close to average in his batting average. And I'm showing you the batting average total stats here, but he's way above average in runs, above average in home runs, slightly above average in RBIs, and he steals a ton of bases like most players at the top of the draft or the highest player values do. They get you a fair amount of stolen bases right off the bat, combined with all the other stats. That's why they're 5 category guys, which are the guys you really want to start your drafts off with. And Francisco Lindor, especially playing a premium position like shortstop, he was also going to be rated very high. He's 8th on my rankings, even though he's getting drafted 16th overall. Same kind of story here. Great stolen bases and above average in every other category. Just a true 5 category guy from the shortstop position. That's why he's going quite high in drafts. And even though he is, I think he still has a tremendous value. So now the question becomes, how much further should we drop these people? How are we going to re-rank these players in order to give ourselves the confidence that we'll still get the best value for these players wherever they may fall in the drafts? And you might say, oh, I'm not even going to touch these guys because how do I anticipate how much time they're out or how they're going to miss? And that's why we want to really kind of look at the average data to give ourselves the best types of projections that we can. So in this case, I started to look up online, did some quick AI searches, and saying when you have this type of surgery, players are usually out 6 to 8 weeks, roughly 42 to 56 days after surgery. Some a little bit shorter than that, but a median of 48 days is common to return to full baseball activities. And then players most likely can return to their previous levels. I think that's most important to take out the uncertainty. I know there is some concern of whether you lose a little bit of power coming back from the surgery, because people are saying it could be 3 to 4 months to fully heal. So you just got to deal with a little bit of pain towards the end of that. But that's the question we're seeing now, is that people are roughly out 6 to 8 weeks, and then they usually return to close to their full performance, or at least 89, 90% of their performance coming from this. And if you'd seen here, the AI is telling us most of the injuries are occurring by vibration of the bats during a swing. So it is not karate chopping wood as I had projected, but that's probably due to getting in some cage work, or maybe doing too much work in the off season. Wherever the case might be for these players, everyone's just coming to spring training or trying to get their reps in before they do, and they are creating some hand injuries. So now the question is, how far are we towards missing time in the league, and how much time will these players miss, so we can figure out how much to knock them down from their projections. So right now there's about 43 days away from opening day, and since they average about 48 days to return with up to 56, it looks like these guys may not be ready for opening day. And they're going to miss a little bit of time, likely starting the year on the IL. Now, the biggest variable we have to deal with is when these players come back is how long because they're going to miss their entire spring training. So how long to, at least all the games. So how long till they actually get back into games and get to their game ready, because they have no spring training. So let's say, they don't know what it's going to be. And if you follow some of these injuries in the past, it can be very frustrating, because you're just waiting day by day for updates to hear it. Well, you'll hear with the resuming baseball activities, and now they're hitting off a tee, and now they're taking some live pitching, and now they may go on a rehab assignment. That's all frustrating news if you're a fantasy owner just trying to wait and see when these guys are coming back. So with the idea that they're going to miss a little bit of time, maybe the first week or so, maybe a couple weeks if they are on the high end of the 8 weeks, plus maybe they'll have to go on either on a rehab assignment or get some time in. Let's just take the very conservative approach and say, let's plan on them to miss the first month of the season, which is, roughly a 6-month season. So 1/6 of the year, or 17% of the season. And then we can quickly do some math and by the numbers have a sober look at what those projections do for us. Now you can, dial that up or down a little bit based on how conservative, how aggressive you think that timetable is, or based on what you hear coming out. But that's, I think, a good base assumption to go into this situation, so that we can approach it with a more sober mind versus totally panicking. When you do it that way, this is kind of what we get. So I hear, and you have Corbin Carroll here in the blue from his initial data here, where he was 5th overall in the player ranking. He was getting a 7.84 total points based on how he's accumulating stuff. If you take 83% of that, which is 5/6, they're missing 1 month of the season, he ends up dropping down to 6.53 points. That's the only column I adjusted in here. And you can see when you do that and you look at it, he actually only falls about 10 spots. In reality, he's like right in line right there with Trey Turner, maybe slightly ahead, but maybe you don't want to take the risk, and in case there's any delay or any setbacks as they come back from this injury. So I put him kind of really after Trey Turner, but in that round top 15 pick. So in first glance, that's not as devastating as I thought it would be, where Corbin Carroll is only falling about 10 picks and still potentially a second round pick, which means if he's still hanging there towards the end of the second round, if you're staring at, when should I draft Jackson Chourio or, anybody like that, Fernando Tatis, maybe even Gunnar Henderson, you might get some good value by getting Corbin Carroll if he's still available. Now, if no one in your league is subscribed to this channel and then does any of the math on this and they're just trying to avoid Corbin Carroll and thinks it's way too much risk, you might get him in the third round. And if you can get him anywhere towards the end of your second round or in your third round, I think he can return some great value for you, because he should be able to come back, give you really good production for the rest of the year, and most players return to form pretty quickly. So now looking at Francisco Lindor, He was the 8th ranked player in my scoring system, getting drafted at number 16. And where is he going? His total was 7.17 points in the total player value. And then you can see here, if you do 83% of his value, he drops down to about 5.97, just below 6. So you can see he ends up being somewhere around 22, 23. In this case, just above Randy Rosarina, even Josh Naylor, even Cal Raleigh, who's getting drafted as 18th. So if you're anywhere near Cal Raleigh, I don't know, maybe you want to take a high side on Nick Kurtz, but if you're somewhere around that part of the draft and Francisco Lindor is still there, you may want to grab him. So now he's actually fallen a little bit further. He's about 15 picks. So it cost Corbin Carroll about 10 picks of value in the draft, and it's costing Lindor about 15. So that's kind of the way to think about it, is Corbin Carroll lost 1 round. Lindor is going to lose about 1.5 rounds of value, at least in my case, but he was already getting drafted 16th in some. So some people may, in your leagues, this is where you can get some value. Some people in your leagues may think you're crazy. If they're staring at Francisco Lindor, hadn't been ranked at 16th, and now you're still taking them around 22, 23, they're going to say, oh, you're still reaching. You're almost assigning full value, right? But you're not really, because he actually has more of an upside value than just being, his average draft position of 16. So you might be able to get him in the like late 3rd round. Maybe he'll slip towards pick 30 or something like that, depending on how aggressive people are in your league or how much information they look at. But if people are thinking Francisco Lindor, his average draft position is 16 and he has this upside value of 8, and 83% of his value actually returns, pick 22, 23, he's likely going to be there for you because if people are thinking, I should start targeting him in 16, maybe I'll drop him a round or 2 or something like that, they're not going to be looking at him into those 20s, and you might be able to get a pretty good deal on him if he's available for you there and comes back on the current time schedules and fully healthy. So this is where I think the soberness of looking at the data, why I love data and numbers. Obviously, there's some risk in all of this, and there's risk of re-injury or setbacks as you go through a rehab process, but don't look as something devastating to your fantasy team. Yes, it's some uncertainty. There's going to be some variables we can't control here, but it actually creates more value for you to potentially get for your fantasy team if you just look at it soberly with the numbers versus just panicking and saying, I've done this in fantasy football before where I just kind of highlight guys in red and say, if they're slightly injured, I don't know how many games they're missing, I'm just not going to draft them at all. I'm going to skip over them no matter where they go, right? Because you just don't know and you don't want that uncertainty. That's why in this case, for baseball being a long season and lasting 6 months, I think there's still a ton of upside value for each of these guys, and I'm going to show you why they didn't drop as far as you might think or as other people are going to assume. And that's because if you look at the player value rank, they actually rank of the players based on their projections. Corbin Carroll here was just below, was the 5th ranked player here at this big tier. So taking 83% of it, dropping him down to 6.53, it wasn't we're on the steep part of this curve. So what people in your league are not anticipating is they're saying, he may drop 3-4 rounds if he's going to miss maybe a month of the season, right? Whereas this curve is so steep here, these players here getting drafted in the top 25 are so much better than all the other players getting drafted after them that the slope of the curve of their performance is so high that even 83% of Corbin Carroll's value is still going to be, one of the top players in the league. It's still not, that's why he's in the 15th this year. So he's not going to drop a whole lot because he was already outperforming so many of the other guys that people might consider just going to the next tier of that position and so forth, right? And same thing with if you go to Lindor, where he was a little bit lower. He was starting out 7.17, now falling around 5.97 or just around 6. So now he's still on that steep part of the curve. Now, if these guys were in the flatter part of the curve, they might drop a little bit further because 83% of their value would take a bigger chunk out of it and more players would pass you. But still, Lindor is still starting at this quite steep part of the curve, and he kind of ends up before this inflection comes down here. So that's why he loses a few more picks here because you got this little flat bulge here, and he loses 15 rather than 10. But Lindor is still worth taking as a top 25 overall player if you're betting on, the surgery goes well and he loses some time. There's a scenario where they come back a little bit earlier and they only miss a couple weeks. I'm predicting a whole month of loss if they want to have a spring training or a rehab assignment or kind of kick off the dust. But there's a scenario where they kind of throw them right back out there and they get them started really early and just say, okay, time to get the season started. You may only miss a week or two. That would be even more potential upside for your team. So again, by looking at the data, we don't have to panic. We don't have to really worry about our teams for uncertainty. We just look at it soberly through the data and look at what it means to the player's actual value of the stats they can collect. And in this case, it's actually not as devastating as I thought it would be and from the beginning. And I can almost guarantee most people in your leagues are going to think it's way worse and really knock them down maybe 2 or 3 rounds. Whereas I think if you wait and they're hanging around there in the 20s, maybe as late as 30, you're going to get a tremendous upside value for your team because everyone's going to panic on the news, especially if your draft is this week. People are still going to be panicking, just not knowing the data, not knowing the uncertainty, not being sure how long they're going to miss. That they're going to wait on it and they're going to bypass these players, and you should grab potentially both of them, right? You could potentially get Carroll in the second round and Lindor in the third round, and that sounds like a potential league winner. That's the type of league winning move you can make by analyzing the data. If you like this kind of stuff, subscribe to this channel and check out one of the other videos that you might like as well.